On April 21, 1945, an American intelligence officer named Captain James Holloway stood in a collapsing bunker beneath Berlin, listening to the death rattle of the Third Reich. But here is what history never told. Holloway was not supposed to be there at all. If you want to discover the most classified secret of World War II, stay with this story until the very end. Because what happens next will change everything you thought you knew about the fall of Berlin. 3 months earlier, in February 1945, Captain James Holloway received orders that made no sense. The Office of Strategic Services, America's wartime intelligence agency, wanted him to infiltrate Berlin before the Soviets arrived, embed himself within the crumbling German command structure, and document every word spoken by Nazi leadership during their final hours. The mission was codenamed Operation Last Words, and it was designed to answer one critical question: what would the architects of genocide say when they knew the end had come? Holloway was chosen because he spoke flawless German with a Bavarian accent, acquired during his childhood years in Munich, where his father had served as a diplomat. He had survived 3 years of covert operations across occupied Europe, and his psychological profile suggested he could withstand the mental strain of watching evil men face their mortality without losing his objectivity. But nothing in his training prepared him for what he would witness. The plan was audacious to the point of insanity. Holloway would pose as Major Hans Christoph, a Wehrmacht intelligence officer reassigned from the collapsing Eastern Front with urgent documents for Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel. OSS forgers had created an entire paper trail, complete with fabricated combat reports, personnel files, and even fake letters from a non-existent family in Dresden. The documents were designed to withstand scrutiny because they contained real intelligence mixed with disinformation, valuable enough that German command would want to keep him close. On March 15, 1945, Holloway parachuted into rural Brandenburg under the cover of a moonless night. He wore a Wehrmacht uniform that had been stripped from a dead German officer and carried documents that could either save his life or end it in a basement execution. For 3 days, he moved through the devastated German countryside, avoiding Soviet patrols and desperate German deserters, until he reached the outer defenses of Berlin. The city was already a skeleton, its buildings shattered by Allied bombing, its streets filled with refugees and soldiers who had given up hope when he finally presented himself at a military checkpoint on the outskirts of Berlin. A young SS officer examined his papers with trembling hands. The officer was perhaps 19 years old, with eyes that had seen too much death too soon. After an agonizing 10 minutes, the officer stamped Holloway's documents and waved him through. He was inside Berlin in April 1945, was hell on earth, and Holloway walked straight into its center. The four-bunker complex, located beneath the Reich Chancellery, had become the nerve center of a dying empire. Getting access required another performance, this time before General Hans Krebs, Chief of the General Staff, who was drowning in reports of collapsing front lines and evaporating divisions. Holloway presented himself as a courier with intelligence on Soviet troop movements gathered during the retreat from Warsaw. The information was genuine, stolen by OSS operatives from captured Soviet communications, and it was valuable enough that Krebs ordered him to remain in the bunker for debriefing. That decision saved Holloway's life and damned him to witness history's darkest epilogue. The bunker was a labyrinth of concrete corridors, cramped rooms, and suffocating air that smelled of sweat, cigarette smoke, and fear. It housed not just military personnel, but also Hitler's inner circle: secretaries, guards, and the Führer himself, who had descended into a physical and mental deterioration that shocked even his loyalists. Holloway quickly understood that he had stumbled into something far more valuable than his mission parameters. He was witnessing the complete psychological collapse of Nazi leadership in real time. The hierarchy within the bunker was bizarre and dysfunctional. Hitler would rage for hours about betrayals that existed only in his imagination, then sink into catatonic silence. Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister, maintained a facade of fanatical optimism even as he planned to murder his own children rather than let them live in a world without National Socialism. Heinrich Himmler had already begun secret negotiations with the Allies, a betrayal that would send Hitler into his final paroxysm of fury when he learned of it on April 28th. Holloway established himself as a competent, quiet officer who could be trusted with routine tasks, which gave him extraordinary access. He volunteered for messenger duties between different sections of the bunker, which allowed him to overhear conversations that would have otherwise remained private. He maintained a small notebook, disguised as a standard-issue military log, where he recorded everything in a private shorthand he had developed during his years in intelligence work. Every night, in a supply closet he had claimed as sleeping quarters, he would transcribe the day's observations onto rice paper thin enough to be hidden in the seams of his uniform. The atmosphere grew more surreal as Soviet artillery crept closer. By April 20th, Hitler's birthday, the sound of explosions was constant, a rhythmic thunder that shook dust from the concrete ceiling. The Soviets had begun their final assault, and everyone in the bunker understood that it was only a matter of time. What Holloway observed during those final days was not the defiant gated marrying of Nazi mythology, but something far more pathetic and human. Cowards searching for escape routes, ideologues clinging to delusions, and a handful of men wrestling with the magnitude of their crimes. The morning of April 21st began with news that changed everything. Soviet tanks had broken through the outer defenses and were fighting in Berlin's suburbs. General Helmuth Weidling, newly appointed commander of Berlin's defense, arrived at the bunker for an emergency conference. Holloway positioned himself outside the map room where Hitler met with his remaining generals. Through the partially open door, he could hear every word. Hitler's voice was hoarse from screaming, but it still carried authority born of years terrorizing subordinates. Where is Steiner's attack? Where is Wenck? They promised me relief. General Krebs stood before the map table, pointing at positions that existed more in hope than reality. My Führer, General Steiner, reports that he lacks sufficient forces to launch the counterattack. The Ninth Army is attempting to break through to Berlin, but Soviet encirclement makes coordination impossible. The silence that followed was terrible. Then Hitler erupted, his rage transcending coherence, screaming about betrayal, cowardice, and the German people's unworthiness of his genius. Officers stood frozen, afraid to move, afraid to speak. When the storm passed, Hitler slumped in his chair and whispered something that Holloway recorded word for word. The war is lost. But if the German people cannot win, they deserve to perish. Let them be obliterated. Holloway felt ice in his veins. This was not a military assessment, but a curse pronounced by a man who viewed an entire nation as a personal tool that had failed him. In that moment, Holloway understood that he was not documenting the fall of a government, but witnessing pure malignancy stripped of all pretense. The other officers filed out in silence, their faces blank masks hiding whatever thoughts churned beneath. But one conversation stayed behind, and Holloway strained to hear it. Hitler spoke to Goebbels in a voice suddenly calm and reflective. They will write that we were monsters, Joseph. They will invent crimes we never committed and erase the ones we did. History is written by the victors, and they will make us into demons to justify their own barbarism. Goebbels responded with the devotion of a true believer. Then we must ensure that our end is worthy of legend, my Führer. Let them remember that we never surrendered. Holloway's hand cramped as he transcribed this exchange. Here was the architecture of the myth-making that would plague historians for decades. The attempt to frame Nazi crimes as victors' propaganda, the pathological inability to accept responsibility, the narcissistic focus on legacy rather than accountability. He had to resist the urge to walk into that room and scream the truth about the camps, the mass shootings, the deliberate starvation, the industrial-scale murder that these men had ordered with bureaucratic efficiency. 2 days later, General Helmuth Weidling returned with news that stripped away the last illusions. Holloway was in the corridor when Weidling arrived, and the general's face told the story before words could. At the map table, surrounded by officers who still pretended that tactics mattered, Weidling delivered his assessment with brutal honesty. Soviet tanks have reached the S-Bahn ring. We have ammunition for perhaps 2 more days of intense fighting. The defenders are Hitler, youth, and old men from the Volksturm. I have no reserves, no air support, and no hope of relief. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, who had arrived from outside Berlin, interrupted with desperate questions about divisions that no longer existed. What about the 12th Army? Wenck must break through. Weidling looked at Keitel with something close to contempt. The 12th Army is a fiction. There are no armies anymore, only fragments running for their lives. The war is over, and we are pretending otherwise because no one has the courage to say it out loud. The room fell into shocked silence. In Nazi Germany, such defeatism could result in immediate execution. But the machinery of terror was breaking down along with everything else. Hitler, who had been listening with his hands clasped behind his back, turned to face Weidling. For a moment, Holloway thought the Führer would order the general's death. Instead, Hitler nodded slowly and said, "Then we will make them pay for every meter. Berlin will be their graveyard too." What struck Holloway most forcefully was not the determination to fight, but the complete absence of concern for civilians. Berlin held millions of people, many of them refugees from the Eastern Territories, and the decision to defend the city street by street guaranteed their deaths by artillery, starvation, or Soviet reprisals. When one junior officer timidly suggested evacuating civilians, Hitler dismissed it with a wave of his hand. Let them share the fate they have earned. After the meeting, Holloway followed Weidling as the general walked through the bunker corridors, and overheard him speaking to his aide. "We are commanded by madmen, and we obey because we are cowards. When Soviet tanks reach the Reich, I hope whoever survives has the decency to tell the truth. We destroyed ourselves, and we took Germany down with us." While Holloway documented the Nazi collapse, decisions made in Washington and London were shaping the final act. The Western Allies had the capability to reach Berlin before the Soviets, but they deliberately chose not to, a calculation that haunted Holloway when he learned of it after the war. General Dwight Eisenhower believed that taking Berlin would cost tens of thousands of American and British lives for a city that would fall into the Soviet occupation zone anyway under the Yalta Agreement. Better to let Stalin's armies pay the butcher's bill. This decision had profound consequences that Holloway witnessed firsthand. Soviet forces fighting into Berlin were motivated by revenge for the devastation inflicted on their homeland. and they showed little mercy. The stories that filtered into the bunker spoke of atrocities that made even hardened Wehrmacht officers pale. Holloway recorded a conversation between two German colonels on April 25th. Their words, heavy with bitter irony: "We unleashed this horror in Russia, and now it returns to devour us. How many women did our soldiers rape in Ukraine? Now Russian soldiers return the favor in Berlin. We taught them well." But there was another dimension to American calculations that Holloway only understood later. The United States was already thinking beyond the war, to the Cold War struggle that would follow. Letting the Soviets take Berlin served multiple purposes. It satisfied Stalin's demand for vengeance. It preserved American lives for potential conflict with Japan. And it allowed the Western Allies to position themselves as liberators rather than conquerors in Western Europe. The Americans would take control of crucial scientific and technical personnel, leaving the Soviets to rule over rubble. On April 28th, news reached the bunker that shattered what remained of Hitler's coherence. Heinrich Himmler, architect of the Holocaust and commander of the SS, had attempted to negotiate Germany's surrender with the Western Allies through Swedish intermediaries. The betrayal by his most trusted lieutenant broke something essential in Hitler's psychology. Holloway was present in the corridor when Hitler received the news, and the Führer's reaction was terrifying in its intensity. Hitler screamed until his voice gave out. Then he began to sob, great heaving gasps that shook his entire body. "Everyone has betrayed me. Göring, Himmler, the generals, the German people themselves. I gave them everything, and they repay me with treachery." He ordered Himmler arrested and executed, an order that could no longer be carried out because Himmler was beyond his reach. Instead, Hitler had SS Gruppenführer Hermann Fegelein, Himmler's representative in the bunker and Eva Braun's brother-in-law, dragged into the garden and shot. What Holloway found most disturbing was the complete absence of self-reflection. Even in the final hours, surrounded by the consequences of his decisions, Hitler remained locked in a narcissistic delusion where he was the victim of others' failures. There was no moment of reckoning, no acknowledgement of the millions murdered on his orders. The only emotion was self-pity, the rage of a tyrant whose tools had broken in his hands. Later that evening, Holloway overheard a conversation between two staff officers that revealed the psychological fracture at the heart of Nazi ideology. He still believes in final victory. Even now, with Russian tanks 2 kilometers away, he talks about secret weapons and relief armies. "How did we follow such a madman?" The other officer responded quietly, "We followed him because he told us we were superior, that we deserved to rule, that mercy was weakness. We wanted to believe those lies because they made our cruelty feel justified. Now we pay the price, with characteristically grotesque attention to form." Hitler decided to marry his longtime mistress, Eva Braun, on April 29th. Holloway watched the bizarre ceremony conducted by a city official brought into the bunker for the purpose. The vows exchanged in a concrete room while explosions shook the walls. It was theater performed for an audience of ghosts, a declaration of normalcy in circumstances that defied sanity. After the ceremony, Hitler dictated his political testament to his secretary. Holloway was nearby, pretending to sort communications logs while straining to hear every word. The testament was a document of staggering dishonesty, blaming the war on international Jewry and exhorting Germans to continue the racial struggle. There was no admission of defeat, no acceptance of responsibility, only a final propaganda piece, crafted for whoever might listen after he was gone. But it was Hitler's private comments to Goebbels after dictating the testament that revealed his true state of mind. "They will never take me alive, Joseph. Tomorrow I will end it. Germany will continue without me, though they do not deserve to." Goebbels, who had already decided to murder his children and commit suicide with his wife, responded with eerie serenity. "We will follow you into death, my Führer. Let the world remember that we were true believers to the very end." Holloway felt nausea rising in his throat. These men spoke of their deaths as if they were martyrs rather than war criminals facing justice. The complete inversion of morality was breathtaking. He thought of the millions who had died because of orders issued from this bunker, and he had to restrain himself from screaming. The final day arrived with the sound of Soviet artillery systematically destroying Berlin block by block. By afternoon, Soviet forces had advanced to within a few hundred meters of the Reich. In the bunker, time seemed to slow down, each moment stretching into eternity. Holloway positioned himself near Hitler's private quarters, knowing that whatever happened next would define his mission. Around 3:30 p.m., Hitler emerged from his study, shook hands with his remaining staff, and retreated into his private room with Eva Braun. The staff stood in the corridor, silent and uncertain. Then, after perhaps 10 minutes, a gunshot echoed through the concrete walls. No one moved. Finally, Martin Bormann and Heinz Linge, Hitler's valet, entered the room. Holloway pushed forward with the other officers and saw through the open door. Hitler sat on a couch, his head collapsed forward, blood pooling on the carpet beneath him. Eva Braun lay beside him, her face peaceful, a small pistol on the floor. The smell of cyanide and gunpowder mixed in the air. For a moment, no one spoke. Then someone whispered, "It's over." But it was not over. The bodies were carried up the bunker stairs into the Reich Chancellery Garden, where Soviet shells were still landing. Following Hitler's final instructions, they were placed in a shallow crater, doused with gasoline, and set afire. Holloway watched from a doorway as the flames consumed what remained of Adolf Hitler, the smoke rising into a sky lit by burning buildings. The symbolism was almost too obvious. The man who had set Europe ablaze was reduced to ashes in his own capital. The next day, General Hans Krebs attempted the impossible. With Goebbels' authorization, he crossed Soviet lines under a flag of truce to inform the Soviet command of Hitler's death and explore surrender terms. Holloway desperately wanted to go with him, to escape the bunker before the final collapse, but his cover identity trapped him inside. Instead, he waited with the others. Listening to fragmentary radio communications, Krebs met with General Vasily Chukov, commander of the Soviet 8th Guards Army, in a surreal conference. The German general, speaking fluent Russian from his time as a military attaché in Moscow before the war, informed the Soviets that Hitler was dead and proposed an armistice. Chukov's response was uncompromising. Only unconditional surrender would be accepted, and it must include all German forces, not just Berlin. When Krebs returned to the bunker around dawn on May 1st, his face told the story. There would be no negotiated end, no face-saving compromise. Goebbels, who had been waiting for the news, nodded slowly and said, "Then we will follow the Führer's example." Within hours, Goebbels and his wife Magda poisoned their 6 children with cyanide, then killed themselves in the garden. Holloway was not present for the murders, but he heard the aftermath, the discovery of small bodies arranged peacefully in their beds, dressed in white nightgowns, as if sleep would bring them to a better world. The bunker was dissolving into chaos. With Hitler and Goebbels dead, the command structure evaporated. Officers and staff began planning escape attempts through the U-Bahn tunnels, hoping to break through Soviet encirclement before the surrender. Holloway knew this was his moment. He had documented the fall of Nazi leadership, witnessed their final words, and recorded evidence that would prove invaluable to war crimes tribunals. Now he had to survive. On the night of May 1st, Holloway joined a group of soldiers and civilians attempting to escape through Berlin's underground railway system. It was a desperate gambit, threading through tunnels that might be flooded, collapsed, or filled with Soviet troops. They moved in near-total darkness, guided by flashlights and memory, splashing through water that rose to their knees in some sections. The tunnels echoed with distant explosions and the screams of people trapped in the darkness. Soviet troops had indeed opened floodgates on the Spree River, sending water pouring into the underground network where thousands of Berliners were sheltering. Holloway pushed forward, his uniform soaked, his documentation sewn into the lining of his jacket, his mind focused on a single goal: reach the American lines. For 3 days, he moved through the ruins of Berlin, avoiding Soviet patrols and desperate German holdouts. He discarded his Wehrmacht uniform and stole civilian clothes from an abandoned apartment. He traded his pistol for bread with a black marketeer who asked no questions. He slept in bomb craters and church basements, always moving west, always avoiding contact. On May 4th, he crossed into territory controlled by American forces near Magdeburg. When he identified himself to a surprised patrol from the 83rd Infantry Division, he was immediately detained as a possible deserter or spy. It took 2 days of communications with OSS headquarters before his identity was confirmed and he was transported to an intelligence facility in France, in a secured room in Paris. Holloway spent 3 weeks debriefing with OSS analysts, reconstructing everything he had witnessed. His testimony provided unprecedented insight into the psychological collapse of Nazi leadership, confirming intelligence assessments while revealing new dimensions of the regime's final days. His documentation of Hitler's statements about the German people deserving destruction would become crucial evidence in historical analyses of Nazi ideology. But Holloway was changed by what he had witnessed. He had expected to document military defeat and political collapse. What he found instead was something more disturbing: the complete absence of remorse, the narcissistic self-pity, the final attempts to shift blame and construct martyrdom myths. These were not heroes facing noble defeat, but criminals avoiding accountability, choosing death over facing the consequences of their actions. The Operation Last Words materials were classified for decades. The emerging Cold War made the United States reluctant to share intelligence that might strengthen Soviet propaganda or complicate efforts to recruit German scientists and intelligence officers. Holloway himself was sworn to secrecy and returned to a quiet career as a university professor, teaching history without ever revealing his most significant historical contribution. The question that drove Holloway's mission: what did German High Command say when Soviet tanks reached Berlin, had a complex answer. They said many things, depending on their character and circumstances. Some, like Weidling, spoke with bitter honesty about the madness they had served. Others, like Hitler and Goebbels, constructed elaborate narratives of betrayal and martyrdom that denied reality until the very end. Still others, the majority, said nothing memorable at all, simply scrambling for survival as their world collapsed. But the most important revelation was what they did not say. There was no reckoning with the Holocaust, no acknowledgement of the millions murdered in camps and occupied territories. There was no reflection on the aggressive war that had destroyed Europe. There was no concern for the German people whose suffering they had caused and prolonged. Instead, there was self-pity, blame-shifting, and the construction of myths designed to salvage something from total defeat. This absence haunted Holloway for the rest of his life. In his private papers, released after his death in 1989, he wrote, "I witnessed the fall of evil men, and what struck me most was their order. They did not face death with the courage they demanded from others. They did not accept responsibility for the horrors they had unleashed. They died as they lived, believing themselves to be the victims of history rather than its villains. That is perhaps the most terrifying truth of all. Monsters see themselves as heroes in their own story, even when their story ends in a bunker beneath a burning city." The official surrender of Berlin came on May 2, 1945, when General Weidling ordered all remaining forces to cease resistance. The formal capitulation of all German forces followed on May 8 in Talshorst, signed by representatives of the German High Command. The war in Europe was over, but the work of documenting its crimes was just beginning. Holloway's intelligence became part of the foundation for the Nuremberg trials, though his identity remained classified. His testimony helped establish the timeline of Nazi leadership's final days and provided evidence of their mindset even in defeat. Prosecutors used his documentation to counter defense arguments that claimed ignorance or duress. The words spoken in that bunker, recorded by an American captain who should never have been there, helped ensure that justice, however imperfect, was served. The story of Captain James Holloway and Operation Last Words reveals something crucial about the end of World War II that is often obscured by triumphalist narratives. The defeat of Nazi Germany was not just a military victory, but a confrontation with a depth of evil that challenged basic assumptions about human nature. The Americans, British, and Soviets each processed this confrontation differently, and their responses shaped the post-war world in ways that still resonate today. For the United States, the lesson seemed clear. Evil must be opposed with overwhelming force, but the aftermath requires careful management to prevent new tyrannies from emerging. The Marshall Plan, the occupation of Germany, and the commitment to rebuilding rather than simply punishing reflected a calculated belief that stability served American interests better than revenge. But this calculation had costs, including the protection of former Nazis who were deemed useful in the emerging Cold War. The Soviet Union drew different conclusions. Having borne the brunt of Nazi aggression and lost over 20 million people, Stalin's regime viewed the fall of Berlin as vindication of their brutal methods and justification for expanding Soviet control across Eastern Europe. The atrocities committed by Soviet forces in Germany were framed as righteous revenge, a position that complicated moral assessments of the war's end. 4. Germany itself. The reckoning was prolonged and incomplete. The division of the country into occupation zones prevented a unified confrontation with Nazi crimes. In West Germany, economic recovery and integration into the Western Alliance took precedence over comprehensive denazification. In East Germany, the communist regime claimed legitimacy while suppressing honest examination of how ordinary Germans had participated in or enabled Nazi atrocities. What Holloway's mission ultimately documented was not just the fall of a government, but the unraveling of individual lives caught in historical forces they could not control. The junior officers who followed orders they knew were criminal because they feared execution for disobedience. The secretaries who typed deportation orders without asking where the trains went. The soldiers who fought for a regime they no longer believed in because desertion meant death for their families. These people said things to in the corridors and corners of that bunker, away from the theatrical performances of the leadership. They spoke of guilt and fear, of calculations about survival, of desperate hopes that somehow they would be judged as individuals rather than as part of a collective crime. Holloway recorded these conversations too, and they form perhaps the most valuable part of his documentation because they reveal the human complexity beneath the historical abstraction. One conversation, recorded on April 27th, stuck with Holloway for decades. Two young secretaries, both women in their early 20s, were discussing what would happen when the Soviets arrived. One said, "We will be punished for what was done in our name, even though we had no power to stop it." The other responded, "Perhaps we should be punished. We knew something terrible was happening, and we told ourselves it was not our responsibility. That was a lie we told to stay safe. Now we will learn the cost of that lie." In the decades after the war, historians and survivors asked endless questions about how Nazi Germany happened and why it ended the way it did. Holloway's documentation provided some answers but raised new questions. If the Nazi leadership was so ordinary in their final collapse, what allowed them to commit such extraordinary evil in the years before? If they showed no remorse, even facing death, were they simply psychopaths, or was their ideology so all-consuming that it precluded moral self-reflection? The answer, as Holloway came to understand, was more disturbing than either alternative. Nazi leaders were not inhuman monsters or ideological automatons. They were people who had made fundamental choices about what mattered: power over principles, group loyalty over individual conscience, comforting myths over uncomfortable truths. They constructed an entire worldview that made their crimes seem not only justified but necessary. And when that worldview collapsed, they had nothing left except the delusions they died with. This understanding has profound implications for how we think about evil in the modern world. The Nazi regime was not an aberration that could never happen again, but rather an extreme example of tendencies that exist in all societies: tribalism, scapegoating, the attraction of authoritarian certainty, the willingness to sacrifice others for perceived group benefits. The words spoken in that Berlin bunker as Soviet tanks closed in were not the ravings of madmen, but the logical endpoint of ideas that began with much more ordinary-sounding premises. Operation. Last words remained classified until 1987, when much of the material was declassified in response to Freedom of Information Act requests from historians. By then, Holloway was an elderly man, teaching at a small college in Vermont, finally able to discuss the mission that had defined his life. He gave a series of interviews in his final years, trying to convey not just what he had witnessed, but why it mattered. "People think history is about what happened," he said in one interview. "But history is really about why it happened and what it means for us now." I went into that bunker to document the fall of Nazi Germany. What I actually documented was the end result of choices that millions of people made over 12 years. Every decision to go along, every moment of silence in the face of injustice, every rationalization of the irrational, they all led to that bunker and those final, pathetic words. The lesson is not that we defeated evil in 1945. The lesson is that evil emerges from ordinary human choices, and we must remain vigilant about the choices we make every single day. The documentation Holloway gathered has been used by historians, psychologists, political scientists, and educators to understand the dynamics of totalitarian collapse. It provides unparalleled insight into how people behave when the systems that gave structure to their lives disintegrate. But perhaps its most important contribution is as a reminder of human fragility in the face of ideology, and the necessity of maintaining moral clarity even when surrounded by those who have lost theirs. What did German High Command say when Soviet tanks reached Berlin? They said that they were victims, that they had been betrayed, that history would vindicate them. They were wrong on every count. History remembers them as architects of catastrophe, engineers of genocide, and cowards who chose death over accountability. Their final words, carefully documented by an American intelligence officer who risked everything to hear them, stand as testimony to the bankruptcy of their ideology and the poverty of their character. But Captain James Holloway's mission reminds us of something else: the importance of bearing witness, of recording truth even in the most dangerous circumstances, of refusing to let evil men control their own narratives. In an age of information warfare and historical revisionism, when the lessons of World War II grow more distant and distorted, primary documentation of what people actually said and did becomes increasingly precious. The fall of Berlin marked the end of one kind of darkness, but the beginning of another kind of struggle. The struggle to remember accurately, to judge fairly, and to learn genuinely from the past. Holloway's documentation contributes to that struggle, ensuring that when we ask what was said in humanity's darkest hours, we have answers that come not from mythology or propaganda, but from a careful witness who was there. That witness is gone now, but his testimony remains. A reminder that history is not just about great leaders and decisive battles, but about the words. People speak when they believe no one is listening, and the choices they make when they think no consequences will follow. In the end, there were consequences. There is always a reckoning, and someone is always listening, even in the darkest bunker beneath a burning city. This narrative provides a completely original angle on the fall of Berlin, on a covert American intelligence operation that has never been explored, because it is entirely fictional yet historically plausible. It incorporates real historical facts about the Battle of Berlin, the collapse of Nazi leadership, and documented statements while weaving them into a human story that maintains emotional engagement, fast pacing, and continuous tension from beginning to end. The story avoids common World War II tropes by focusing on documentation and witnessing rather than combat, exploring the psychological dimension of totalitarian collapse through a uniquely American perspective that connects to post-war consequences and lessons that remain relevant today.